Sveiki! I got a Latvian t-shirt on today, and welcome to the weekly Q&A. So if you're watching this live, please drop a comment or a question into the comment section down below the video. My name is Connor Klein. Привit. I am an expert in international relations. I have an academic background in the field, and I've been living in Ukraine for many years. Speak Ukrainian, Russian, and some other regional languages. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced and interesting perspective on the Russo-Ukrainian war. So in the last week, we have seen Russia continue to make advances in the Kursk pocket, Kursk Oblast. This is a small piece of territory in Russia de jure that has been controlled by Ukraine since last summer. Russia made major advances when the US cut off the intel, and well, mainly the intel was probably the key thing. Whether that had a direct effect or not, that's unclear at this moment. The two coincided. They also paused the military supplies to Ukraine in an attempt to gain leverage over Kiev to force them into a ceasefire agreement with Russia. In other parts of the battlefield, there have been some small Ukrainian advances around Kutrovsk, which is a city in the east of Ukraine that Russia was actually expected to have already taken months ago. However, they have probably prioritized the Kursk Oblast, and also Ukraine took a few villages in Belgorod Oblast in Russia as well. Not really clear what the strategic purpose of taking those villages was exactly. And with respect to the political situation, obviously there has been overtures to find some sort of ceasefire, or at least a partial cessation of hostilities in the last week. That has continued. This week there should be meetings in Saudi Arabia again between the parties, some sort of short diplomacy. But basically the US administration's, the new Trump administration's policy has been to take the cards, to use that metaphor that Donald Trump used himself in the Oval Office in that spot with Volodymyr Zelensky, to take the cards that the US holds on behalf of Ukraine and give them to Russia, right? So Hegseth, the defense secretary, took off the table joining NATO. Well, not sure if Hegseth said it. He said that they won't get into NATO. That the administration has said that Ukraine should give up territory. That Ukraine will have to hold elections, and basically that Russia doesn't really have to give Ukraine anything, even though it's Russia that has invaded illegally Ukraine in breach of obviously the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, more specifically where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons to Russia, as well as some other military assets, and in violation of international and many other treaties that have been signed between Russia and Ukraine, including those signed by Putin, the current Russian leader. Tens of thousands of war crimes, mass damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, abducted children in the tens if not hundreds of thousands. And Russia apparently doesn't have to face any consequences for that, according to the US administration. If they were to agree to some sort of ceasefire, they would be in a strong position to try and codify those concessions in some sort of peace agreement. That's in effect would be a capitulation agreement. So is there any grand strategic vision behind this? Let's look at the evidence. There has been a theory that I remember from when I was studying international relations. I studied in the US at SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and we did have a student who was probably ideologically a precursor to MAGA and even a precursor to the Tea Party back in those days. It's over 20 years ago. He espoused the theory that US should abandon Europe and form an alliance with Russia to balance China, and basically give as much of Europe as Russia wanted for them to control. Maybe not the entire continent, but most of it. So at least Central and Eastern Europe. The idea is then that together they will be stronger to tackle China. However, when you look at Russia's assets, well, it doesn't have a very big economy. It nowadays has a dwindling population, well, that's the same in most of Europe, and also in North America a little bit less. They don't have really much to offer except for some resources that really for the US are not that important, and its huge nuclear weapons stockpile, partly because Ukraine gave it to them in 1994. And does the US really need that extra nuclear arsenal? I mean, I guess combined they would obviously dwarf everybody else in terms of nuclear weapons. It's very hard to know if the Russian nuclear deterrent actually works very well because it's expensive to maintain, and Russia is a country that doesn't have a good track record of keeping these kind of weapons in good shape. They also use the Orishnik, their rocket, which they fired at Ukraine, not using a significant warhead, and then the second one fails. Kind of suggests to me there isn't that much there. So that is, if you're looking for a strategic overall plan, is why the US would want to throw Ukraine and basically Europe under the bus, under a Russian tank, in order to create a new alliance to balance the growing threat of China, or the growing power of China. However, there is a major issue in any potential alliance between US and Russia, and that is the fact that ideologically, US is a liberal democracy, Russia is an illiberal dictatorship, and so ideologically they don't really have much in common. And in particular, an issue for Russia would be they would have to give up their current relationship with China. China has been somewhat of a decent ally in the last 3 years in particular. They've been integrating further, they've been supplying the Russian economy with much needed foreign cash in exchange for their resources, also some military support, not very significant compared to maybe what North Korea and Iran are providing the Russians, but still it is something that helps their war effort. And whilst China is actually a really significant threat to Russia, especially in the Far East, where Russia has a very small population and cannot, it's very hard to defend Russia's frontiers because they're so long and so big, and they've lost so much equipment in the Russo-Ukrainian war that presumably they don't have any capacity in the conventional war to defend themselves against China, which has a much bigger population just across the border and some historical claims to territory that's now in Russia from the 19th century, which have been in China itself. So that is the first thing, is they don't have much in common ideologically, and China is helping Russia at the moment, so Russia really risk that help from China in order to be in alliance with the US, in particular because US is, at least at this point in time, a liberal democracy with regular elections, and Donald Trump is constitutionally prevented from running again in, well, it will be 2028 to stay on as president of 2029. And the US presidency has switched, and it's kind of been going back and forth quite a bit in the last 2 decades, who controls the legislature and executive. So would Vladimir Putin, who clearly plans to stay on as Russian leader, as a dictator, would he, and for many years it must be pointed out, he's not that old. He probably sees himself being president for at least another 15, 20 years if he is not removed in some sort of probable coup d'etat. Would he risk upsetting China and switching sides, in effect, when in less than 4 years there will be a US election that might reverse that strategic policy by the US? I doubt that he's going to take that gamble. I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is the US basically giving much of its bargaining power away to Russia in the attempts to get a quick ceasefire, so that presumably Donald Trump will have something to show for his efforts over the last, he claimed before the election that he solved in 1 day. Maybe in 100 days he gets some sort of temporary ceasefire, and then he declares that he achieved something that would almost certainly break down very quickly, and the war will go back on, and he would probably wash his hands of it. Or if he manages to give so much to Russia that they actually win completely, then I guess we'll have peace. But peace in our time, to quote 1938 and the Munich Agreement and Neville Chamberlain. So not very reassuring. The last big thing is, since one of my viewers here sent me Steve Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson, it appears that significant members of the new Trump administration repeat Russian talking points almost verbatim at this stage. They do not seem to have any other perspective, or maybe that's the strategy, just to frame everything in Russia's worldview and as a way of justifying giving away so much to Russia in an attempt to, again, prize them away from China. Some memorable quotes were his description of Vladimir Putin praying when Donald Trump, when there was a failed assassination attempt on his life in 2024, and that he presented Witkov with a painting from a famous Russian artist of Donald Trump to give to Donald Trump. Now, it's kind of interesting to see where that painting ends up. If Donald Trump took possession of that painting, well, at least that's prima facie illegal and would constitute basically a bribe. I think it's like when I worked as an intern on Capitol Hill, it's like anything that's over $100, a politician could not accept as a gift because it would be the perception that maybe they were being influenced by it. So that was the first thing. And I don't know, did Vladimir Putin go and pray? Probably because he really wanted Donald Trump to become president, because without that, he didn't have much of a strategy to win this war with the current impasse on the battlefield. However, Donald Trump becoming president, what we've seen over the last few months, proves that Vladimir Putin was correct to fight on in the expectation that Donald Trump would become president. Also, Witkov repeated, stunningly repeated Russian talking points that the Russian speakers of the East of Ukraine are Russians who want to be Russia. Of course, that is not true. Just because someone speaks a language doesn't mean that, if Witkov speaks English, does that mean he wants to be part of the United Kingdom or England? I presume not. So on the face of it, it is not a very convincing argument, although it is something that is part of Russian foreign policy, where they have tried to create the right to intervene to protect Russian speakers, which basically involves them bombing the crap out of and killing many Russian speakers, just like in Mariupol, where Russia effectively sacked the city in 2022 with mass civilian casualties. So the fact that he repeat this is very concerning. On top of it, he claimed that there have been referenda legitimate referenda, he seemed to be indicating, for Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea, when none of these referenda are recognized under international law has been valid. Not even the one in Crimea in 2014 didn't meet any of the standards to be a valid referendum under international law. And on top of it, Russia doesn't even control the capitals of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast. So it's farcical. Actually, when Russia launched those fake referenda, it looked like it completely undermined their even claim to have had a fair referendum in Crimea even further. But there we have a special envoy from the US government just repeating this nonsensical, embarrassingly nonsensical talking points from the Kremlin. And so we see that a certain number of the new administration are definitely on Russia's side in these negotiations. You don't repeat these ridiculous talking points without being so. Could they really just be that naive? Head of National Security, Tulsi Gabbard, has repeated similar stuff in the past for many years. So maybe this is just the information that they're being fed and they're completely ignorant. Hard to know exactly, or if it's willful ignorance or if unwitting ignorance. So that is the state of play. We will see more negotiations this week. We are a long way away from any cessation of hostilities, even this temporary thing where they're not going to fire at each other's infrastructure. Is still very skeptical that will happen. Vladimir Putin violated it within 90 minutes of his phone call with Donald Trump last week. And also there was the embarrassing scene, for if you are American, of Vladimir Putin making Donald Trump wait for an hour, and he was actually on Russian TV. And when it was brought up that Trump was waiting, he basically dismissed it as, so what? This is how, this shows the difference between how Vladimir Zelensky behaves with Donald Trump and how the Trump administration deals with Zelensky versus the relationship with Vladimir Putin, where Vladimir Putin can openly disrespect the American president. And they just go and they basically genuflect before him and offer him stuff. Whilst Vladimir Zelensky always has to be extremely diplomatic and reverential towards the U.S. administration. And in response, if he isn't considered to be deferential enough by J.D. Vance or Donald Trump, he basically gets attacked verbally and in a Jerry Springer-like scene in the Oval Office and completely disrespected. So very bizarre to see. Again, maybe the grand strategy is that they're so desperate to get in this alliance with Russia that they're just basically willing to take any sort of deal, and that is particularly worrying it should be worrying from the U.S. perspective, not just Ukraine's. Ultimately, I don't see Ukraine capitulating. That is what the U.S. is trying to demand. It looks even more wide in terms of its perspective. If we look at the U.S. administration and its relationship with Canada, its other allies like the European Union, threatening Greenland, that in fact the global strategic plan is to undermine the U.S.'s traditional alliances and their allies and usher in a new age of imperialism and multipolarity, where they see it being three main players: China, Russia, and the US, and they don't care. They actually want Europe, apparently, to be crushed. That is where I'll leave it. I'll be glad if that turns out not to be the case, but that is what the preponderance of evidence suggests at the moment. And we will see how things develop this week. We've seen Ukraine's European allies ramp up the perspective of spending huge amounts of money on their defense industries going forward, in their national security and assistance to Ukraine. So hopefully Volodymyr Zelensky, from Ukraine's point of view, hopefully Volodymyr Zelensky is able to play for more time, and that the European allies can fill some of the gaps that inevitably the withdrawal of US support, which seems almost certain under Donald Trump at this point. Okay, there's a small chance because he flip-flops that suddenly he'll come back and arm Ukraine, and I'll be delighted and be the first to talk him up if he were to do that. So let's see what comes of it and how much Europe is able to do for Ukraine. It's something I've advocated for 20 years, that we need a strategic independence from the United States and to take care of security on the continent, and also the ability to project power and represent our interests and protect our interests. That wasn't something that European countries have been willing to do. However, Europe always needs a crisis in order to integrate more fully and get closer to being more of a federation as opposed to a hybrid federation. So hopefully we don't let a good crisis go to waste. So I'm going to leave it like that. If you're watching this in replay, please drop your comment below or a question, and I will do my best to respond to all of them. And yeah, this channel in general has been growing in terms of viewership and subscribers in the last month. It's doubled in the last month. So with a good perspective to hopefully double again in the next month. So if you find any of my content interesting, please share it with people that you think will get some value from it. Other things down below in the description to this live stream is a link to buy my guide. If you are going to go to Ukraine, I have a guide that will help you with the logistics, obviously to stay safe. Clear caveat is Ukraine is a country that is the theater for the biggest war in Europe since World War II. So obviously you should not be cavalier with your own personal security. And I have a hospitality guide for going to my favorite places in Kyiv, Odessa, Chernovtsi, Uzhhorod, and Lviv. So that will be super valuable for you. And also, if you want to make a contribution to give me a little bit more motivation, my PayPal is down below. At the moment, this channel is not monetized. I'm probably about I think I need double the watch time in order to get to the first milestone where I can offer to become a member of the channel, and then an extra 1,000 watch hours after that, so that I can monetize it. So I'm probably, well, it depends how things go. If I get a month like the last month in terms of doubling again, then I guess we'll pass that. If not, it might be a bit longer. So all contributions are, of course, extremely welcome to keep me motivated and producing content. So I'll leave it at this. I'm going to go and enjoy one of the first days of spring here in the Baltics. I'm still in the Baltics, but probably leaving to return to Ukraine very shortly. So I'll say do побачення, which is goodbye in Ukrainian, and yeah, drop me comments down below. Ciao ciao for now.